A bungalow in a rural area, how much do you think that costs?
Based off of the current economy, $300,000.
You're wrong.
More?
What do you think it is?
When you say bungalow, you just mean like a really small house?
Yeah, like a 1,000 square foot house.
Bungalows are single-story, 1,000 square foot homes.
In central West Virginia?
Right, we're not in central. We're in the Eastern Panhandle, so we're not that far. But how much you think a bungalow goes for in this area?
Oh, right here. Well, in this area, we're right outside of DC. I mean,
An hour and 40 minutes outside of DC, you mean?
it's still going to be really expensive because you have all these people commuting in. I mean,
if it's $500,000, I want to take a hammer.
It's 600,000.
Yeah, I want to take a hammer and hit myself in the head.
That doesn't surprise me. Yeah.
So how is a young person who's getting an entry level job in the city? How do they start a family and buy a home? And I'll tell you why this number matters. How much do you think a bungalow cost 3 years ago in this area?
Oh yeah, like $200K.
$200K.
Yeah.
There was a house not far from here that we were looking at. It was two.
Are you getting depressed?
The Gen Z producers are throwing up right now. Guys, I'm looking at the Gen Z producers. I don't know.
Yeah, you're screwed. Sorry, guys.
There was a bungalow. There was a bungalow in this area for $250.
Yeah.
3 years ago. Now it's $600.
Yeah, that was a steal.
And it's crazy because back then I was like, there's no reason I don't need investment properties. I'm not going to buy it. I was encouraging other people, talking to my brother, like, hey, maybe you should buy this one. He didn't. We went and looked at it. Now it's $600.
Yeah.
And I went and looked at a house the other day, also in this area, and it's $450, and it's dilapidated.
Well,
anyway, sorry. My ultimate point is, with the debt to GDP ratio, the lack of new workers coming in, and the taxation level we're at right now, you cannot take more from Gen Z already.
I disagree.
You disagree? These people can't afford to start families. They can't afford to buy homes. And you're saying, let's take more money from them.
Well, let me explain to them. So,
blood from a stone.
You brought it. You mentioned you mentioned Japan earlier.
Sure.
And Japan's actually a great example to talk about what Tim's talking about. So Japan, declining population, crazy debt to GDP, right?
High standard of living.
Very, very high standard of living, and very affordable housing. How do they accomplish that? They just have
the dead people.
No. They just have a way more efficient and better system for building housing, right? And so, to the point that Tim's making, it's not that what Tim is saying is an unreasonable thing to care about, right? Like, obviously, affordable housing is important, but we're linking all of these different conversations. Oh, we have a high debt. We might have a decreasing population. Housing is more expensive. That's completely irrelevant to the fundamental point of we need to distribute money to non-workers. And I agree. We need a better tax code. We need a way better system for building housing. And population decline is a problem. But even if I take all those things to be true, we still need to give a lot of money to these people.
Let me say this. I agree that I'm a fan of welfare systems.
Communist.
I personally, I consider myself to be kind of like a liberal, but liberal these days just means like, do you agree with their worldview or not?
Sure.
So if I said something like, I personally got unemployment benefits before, and it really helped me. I lost my job through no fault of my own, went through a lawsuit, and while I was in this limbo period for several months, I filed for unemployment and kept up with it, followed the rules, and they paid me like $100 a week, some ridiculous amount of money. But that fed me. And I'm appreciative of that system. I've also worked for homeless shelters, and I have personally met many homeless people who, through no fault of their own, ended up losing their property, losing their job, but quickly turned things around when given the opportunity. But that is the minority of homeless people. Most homeless people are homeless because they cannot not be homeless, and a lot of them want to be homeless. So, for instance, there's a group that call themselves the AVRATs in Washington. These are young people who refuse to get off the streets. They want to be a part of this group. They receive welfare benefits. Then in California, one of the biggest problems with homeless people in California where I worked is if you go to them and say, we will literally take a house, it's a 3-bedroom. You can live in it like a house. They go, no, we refuse. Give me money instead. And if you walk up to them and say, I would like to give you food or I'd like to give you clothing, they would say, give me money instead. What they end up doing is they end up receiving benefits, and they use it on what we see a lot of is they'll stand outside of a supermarket. They'll tell young people, I got $200 in food benefits. I'll buy whatever you want. Just give me $100. And then young people, not always young people, this is big in Seattle. They'll be like, deal. I get $200 worth of groceries for me, and you get $100 for heroin. And that's what they end up doing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Tim, obviously, so we're now talking about like sort of mechanically, how do you distribute benefits, and like how should we prevent people from like, you know, using benefits for drugs or whatever, or like people say if you give child allowances, what if the money doesn't actually go to the children, right? And here's what I'll say. Here, I'll make a big point, and then I'll directly address your point. The big point is there's just so much research on this. There's so much research on what do poor people do with the benefits that they get, right? What do they do, right? And the overwhelming amount of that money, right? Like 90, 95, 99% of it, right? Depending on the program, goes towards just the things that poor people need to live. It goes towards rent, it goes towards food, it goes towards their car payments, right? Or, you know, whatever their circumstances are. Now, to the exact like type of person that you're talking about, Tim, which is a huge minority of the people that are receiving benefits. I mean, think about it, right? There's 70 million people on Medicaid, another 70 million on Medicare. There's hundreds of millions of people in this country who are receiving some kind of cash payment or government benefit, right? The minority of the people that you're talking about, you know, how should we handle them? I mean, I can tell you what some other countries do. Like, for instance, I think it's in Finland, you get cash benefits, which is called like your housing allowance, but it's just cash, right? It's meant to go towards your housing expenses. There are some people who have a history of like not paying their landlord and just like irresponsibly using the money. They have terrible credit. And so the state comes in and says, okay, we're just going to directly pay your landlord, right? Because we can't like trust you with cash. So there is some like paternalism and things like that these systems probably require, but that's not, I certainly wouldn't, and I don't know that you're saying that. That's not, some conservatives will say, and that's why we just shouldn't have these benefits, right?
So then
and that's ridiculous.
The solution would be anybody receiving government health benefits should be required to be on a specific diet and engage in specific exercises.
Well, in a kind of boy, to kind of move it, because I feel like we're dancing around this point repeatedly. Tim and I, unfortunately for chat, are statists. So they're like, oh, this is just three filthy communists having a conversation about communism, right? That's what they're thinking.
Right.
Which degree of communism do you want?
Right. So you know, to your point, I accept that some level of government redistribution needs to exist. I think Tim accepts that as well. So we're filthy communists compared to the chat. So you making that point again, you're not going to find argumentation. But what I think that,
but it sounds like what Tim brought that up as like this sort of inherent, it seems like it's sort of inherent criticism of the welfare state, right? And it's like, that's just very much not a reason.
But the concern,
to be skeptical.
This is the concern. May I? So this is the concern, though, is that we have seen perverse incentive systems destroy economies. Okay, so as an example, Venezuela, it was effectively like a what would you call it? Like a mono commodity economy for a long time, generous welfare state. But what happened when their commodity was oil? Yeah. What happened when they kicked out all the capitalists? And what happened when the oil economy didn't do what they were predicting it to do? It effectively destroyed their economy. And so as a result, you have people who are starving, all that kind of stuff. That's something that I absolutely want to prevent here. Yeah. Same thing with...
I can tell you how to prevent it.
Well, sure. Yeah. Let's talk about that momentarily. But if we look at Maoist China, if we look at the Soviet Union, if we look at historical examples of socialism, I think you identify as a social democrat, the socialism has been disastrous through command economy flubs. Now, not just that, but we also see micro disasters. So if we're talking about like California or the Pacific Northwest, I've had these conversations. I know it's anecdotal. However, they're not pleasant places to live in certain regards, even for the ultra wealthy. My family, I hate to bring it up, but I have a family member who the husband makes around, probably more than $150,000. The wife makes more than $150,000 or whatever. But because they were living in the Pacific Northwest in a major urban center, they effectively had to walk through drug-addicted homeless people who were being subsidized by the state, who made the common areas less livable. And so that's where the intent behind what you're saying can be 100% noble. Let's take care of homeless people. Let's get them food. Let's make sure that they have clean needles so they don't pass diseases. Sure. But there are rotted urban centers inside the United States of America, particularly in, let's say it, left-leaning cities, where the perverse incentives have overtaken the original noble intent. And so that's what I think a lot of people are worried and scared about.
Well, look, I wouldn't put,
angry.
I wouldn't want Gavin Newsom to be in charge of designing my ideal welfare state.
Sure.
Right? I think that there are a lot of...
Swedish guy.
Yeah, exactly. We need some Swedish guy. But no, I mean, there's a lot of problems within, I think, democratic politics with regards to how we talk about these things. And certainly the solutions, it's ironic because, like, you have a lot of Democrats that they're like, oh, we need to do this, that, and the other to prevent exactly what you guys are talking about. But the answers are actually a lot simpler, right? So I advocate for things like universalizing welfare benefits, having an efficient tax code. You talk about homeless people in these urban cities, right? One of the things that I find so interesting when you see like people who travel to Nordic countries and they come back, one of the first takeaways that they have is there's just no homeless people. What the hell? Like, I thought you go to a major city, there's just a shitload of homeless people.
So hold on.
Well,
real quick meme. They freeze to death. Continue.
Well, no, because there's a lot of homeless people in like cities like Detroit and stuff, right, that are very visible, right?
They also freeze to death. But continue.
But they're very visible, right? I mean, you get what I'm saying. Like, that's not really true. Same thing with Canada and a lot of those urban centers, right? So it's like, well, what are those countries doing, right? It's not that they don't have people that struggle with housing, but what do they do? They offer pretty generous benefits to people to get into housing. They offer a housing first approach to people. They do jobs training. Like, there's just like this sort of holistic benefit. And they tend to have either a non-market system or an efficient market system for distributing housing. Like, it ends up being very affordable. Take a city like San Francisco, right? A city like San Francisco will dump a ton of money, like nominal dollars, into public housing. Oh, we're going to build public housing and we're going to let homeless people live there. And then they're not homeless. They'll get on their feet and all that stuff. One of the biggest problems with these cities is not the fact that they want to offer benefits, right? Which is kind of, it seems like how we're framing the conversation. It's not the benefits themselves. It's the fact that in San Francisco, the zoning ordinances are so ridiculously constrictive that to build like 100 units of public housing costs $100 million or some ridiculous amount, right? And so that's a problem holistically of governance, right? But it's certainly not a problem with the welfare state or the idea that we would offer things like cash benefits, clean needle exchanges, like all those things that you just mentioned.
Boy, I want you to hear me, okay?
I'm hearing you.
This is a safe space amongst three communists who are all discussing how to distribute the economy. Okay, this is a safe space. All right,
how to share the wealth.
Yeah, right. So we are talking about how we distribute these things, but I think that, so for instance, exactly what you're saying with housing. There are a lot of well-intended left-leaning people, liberals, Democrats, all that kind of stuff, and they talk about things that I think are criminally insane as if it's completely normal. One of them is the NIMBY movement, right? Or the YIMBY movement, right? So not in my backyard versus yes in my backyard.
You think YIMBYs are insane?
I think YIMBYs are a little insane.
Okay.
And so the reason why is because the cities, New York, Los Angeles, Miami, right? The biggest cities in the world or whatever. Yeah. They're already very claustrophobic, tens of thousands of people crammed together, elbow to elbow, all that kind of stuff. Their solution to housing costs in these already very claustrophobically built cities that people want to live in for, I would say, intangible reasons, because they want to be cool, they want to be in New York, they want to be in Los Angeles, they want to be in Miami. Their solution is to take a 1,500 square foot apartment and then split it up into 3 500 square foot units. That doesn't sound like human thriving to me. That sounds like a rat's nest. So that's where the intent of some of these policies, it's like we need to think more comprehensively about the kind of lives that we want to build for human beings. And I feel like the left sometimes, generally speaking, has very terrible ideas.
When we talk about major cities...
You're saying it's only an effective governance, which I agree with. But the governance matters because what's popular on the left, so that's incredibly stupid.
Well, look, if we're talking about we have an immovable object and an unstoppable force here, right? Okay. We have a shitload of people who want to live in LA.
My autism and your autism.
Right, yeah. We have a shitload of people who want to live in LA, and we obviously have a limited geographic area, right? Mm-hmm. And so the natural solution to that YIMBYs would suggest is build densely. Now, obviously, hey, if you want to have a 2,000 square foot home in the middle of LA, it's just going to be really expensive, right? Even if you do the policies that YIMBYs are talking about, right, you're going to have to pay a lot more for a huge apartment. But I don't know that that's necessarily bad for people's culture or sense of community. Look at a city like Tokyo, biggest city on the planet. It's an insanely sprawling, just metropolis, right? They have very affordable units. They have units that are much more expensive, but it's very, very densely built. But when you go to places like that, everyone who visits there, people who live there, there's not famous, but he's a Noah Smith. He's a guy who blogs a lot. He actually lives in Japan most of the time, in Tokyo. They don't talk about, like, I guess in some sense it's like, oh, I wish I had more space in some intrinsic sense, but it's like, damn, it's so nice to live in a dense area with like all this stuff around me. There's so much to do. That's the reason why people go to cities like that, right? You can't have your cake and eat it too and be like, I should have a $100,000 home in a place that millions of people want to live.
No, right? I agree with you that that's a stupid impulse.
And so just to add to that, the problem with a lot of these cities is they require civil servants to live in those city boundaries. So then you end up with problems in Chicago. Largely,
You're talking about like in New York, they're like you have to live in New York to be a police officer.
I believe it's true for most jurisdictions. San Francisco, for instance, if you want to be a cop there, you got to live in the city limits. Good luck. They don't pay you enough to afford a house there.
Well, that's dumb. I agree.
We could argue that this is an issue of governance, though.
Yeah,
so, for instance, like here's your commie take of the day. I think that there effectively should be affordable districts within the country within the city where you just know that your working class is going to work there. So, for instance, like New York City, one of the most expensive, beautiful cities. Well, not beautiful. It's actually a rat's nest. But it's one of the most sought after, is what I was looking for, cities on the planet. Basically swaths of Brooklyn should be held for the working class because they are the people who make the city run, and they should not have to have a 3-hour commute in order to make it into the city.
But hold on. Project housing has typically failed.
Well,
Yeah, I
but
agree.
Tim, project housing has failed because
Other reasons.
Well, yeah, we just don't do it right. I mean, like I think that, for instance, when you look at Singapore is a very densely populated, and it's a city, right? So I think a lot of people say, "Oh, we can't Singapore apply to the country."
If you
We're
want
talking
to
about
argue,
cities here,
if you want to argue that we should cane people in public
Yes.
for violating the law,
Yes.
conservative take, yeah, no,
that's what Singapore does, and that's why they.
Well, that's not why they have
a nice urban downtown.
That's not why they have affordable housing, though.
Sure.
But it actually is
It's just a benefit.
No, it's not, Tim. Come on, that's ridiculous.
Yes, if you spit gum, you can be caned. If you don't flush a toilet, you can be caned.
He's talking about affordability, not necessarily whether or not it's a nice place to live.
No, my point is, the authority structure is completely tied to its economic structure.
Well, I didn't make my point.
But so let me tell you, I went to Singapore, and they had a problem with a bunch of, I think it was Filipino and Indian people who had come in to be used as cheap labor. They were told, you will do this or else. And when they started protesting, they arrested them all and beat them publicly in the street. Yeah. So when you get cheap slave labor from foreign countries to maintain your standard of living under threat of mercilessly beating them in public, you can maintain those standards of living.
No, that's not true. So when we look at the reason
Sorry
I
for
brought
laughing
up,
because I'm agreeing with Singaporeans, but sorry. my bad.
No, but the reason I brought up Singapore was not to talk about like their entire justice system. Obviously, they have a very sort of draconian set of regulations on a lot of things, which I'm sure a lot of them we wouldn't necessarily agree with. Like their drug policy, for instance, is extreme.
Your house can't fall apart in a place where they beat you for your house falling apart.
Well, no, not. I don't.
Did you know that they
right?
check the toilets in Singapore? Don't use Singapore as an example. Let's just move on.
No, we're not going to move on.
Okay, in Singapore,
Goodness, Tim,
there
let
are
me make my point.
there are people where if you leave food on the table, they can report you to the police, and you can get in trouble for this. Usually, it's a fine. It is considered improper if you don't flush the toilet, and people actually look.
Okay.
So if you have a house and there is gum on the sidewalk, that's illegal. If you have housing in the United States, what do we end up seeing? It gets trashed, it falls apart, and we're required to pay for services from the public coffers to fix it. In Singapore, they beat you in public.
So, Tim, the reason I brought up Singapore was not to talk about their civil society, you could say.
You
right?
keep trying
Tim,
to
for God's
cut out.
sakes,
No.
You won't let me make the point.
Absolutely, I will not, because you keep changing the subject. You are trying to act like
Connor
the social
said-
order.
Connor
You're not going to
said-
let me make a point.
Connor said, no, well, you're not letting me make a point.
You keep changing the
Connor
point
said-
that the social order of a society is connected to its economic, to its spending. Houses in Chicago are falling apart, and because the public housing is falling apart in Chicago, because people mistreat the properties, do drugs, and fire guns at them.
Yeah, Tim.
If you did that in Singapore, you would be beaten in public.
So what Singapore does is not just that, Tim. You'd agree they don't have one policy. What Connor said was, I think that working class people should be able to live in, city centers without, all these different bidding wars happening, and they just essentially get priced out of the area. How does Singapore do that? They don't do that by beating people with canes. They have a non-market public housing system, right? So that's the thing you wouldn't let me make the point on. That's the point, right? That you have to have all of these things together. You have to have an efficient system for building housing, obviously. I guess if you're Tim or Connor, maybe you, need to
Who maintains
have
the
some
house?
crazy stuff, right?
Who maintains the house?
The individuals that live there, and obviously some public as well.
Okay, so let's break this down. You have public housing.
Yeah.
It has to be maintained by somebody. If someone can't afford to buy and maintain a house, who pays to maintain it?
The state.
The state. Okay.
Public
now,
housing.
in Singapore, if you don't maintain your property, they will beat you in public. In Chicago, if you don't maintain your property, it just falls apart and there's drugs and guns everywhere.
Singapore.
He's passionately making a point that I thought was an overview of what we were going to talk about today, which is effectively,
Wait, Connor, do you agree with me on the point that to do what you're talking
they
about,
have
you need a
intentional
system of
policy
public
related.
investment?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Okay. Well, we agree,
But,
actually.
But hold on, there's a point here that I think Tim is making very passionately that I agree with, which is effectively that if you're going to have a welfare state, you need a level of what's considered, particularly in America, socially conservative enforcement. Because what happens what we're worried about, what we're talking about, when we're talking about entire areas of LA being overrun with the homeless, when we're talking about the Pacific Northwest having all these issues with needles on the street, when we're talking about San Francisco having human feces and that just being like a normal thing, what we're talking about is we're talking about the state intervening in order to try to make people's lives better, but not feeling like they have the authority to enforce like equality or standards. And so that's where I don't think that you can have one without the other.
Well, obviously, like if to address your points, both of your points directly, right? When it comes to like, oh, what do we do with these people who are just on drugs and they're fucking everything up in downtown for us?
Yep.
Well, obviously, look, I mean, I think look at the city of Houston.
You're about to get
actually.
accused of being a Nazi, but
Well, no. I mean, look at the city of Houston. The city of Houston, they decreased their homeless population by about 50% over the last 12 years. And the city of Houston's a city with a revenue cap, right? They literally cannot raise taxes to like infinite levels because the people say you can't do that, right? So they had to figure out a creative way to do this. What they did was they had a camping ban mixed with public housing for homeless people. And essentially they said, hey, if you're homeless and there's room in the shelters, you've got to go to the shelters. And then the shelters are connected with like resources for homeless people. Hey, rehab, clean needle, all this kind of stuff, right? And that decreased the homeless population by like 50%, right? Now, to be fair to Tim's point, we didn't do that by beating the shit out of homeless people on the street, but we did say you have to do certain things and there's certain obligations that you have. I don't necessarily disagree with that. My only point about Singapore was that they have a huge system of public non-market housing, which is one of the fundamental ways that you can extend affordable housing to people, in addition to those behavioral things you're talking about.
So thanks for watching this clip from the Culture War podcast. We're live every Friday, 10 a.m. to noon. So subscribe and come hang out.